Grandmother used to say that some people mistake silence for weakness. She said it in French, the way she said most things that mattered. Le silence, Miss Paula Fable say, ma chérie. And I never understood it until the night my uncle stood in our kitchen holding a piece of paper and told me that Grandma Irene had left me nothing. Not reduced, not overlooked, nothing. I was 28 years old, standing in the house I grew up in, and I had just driven 4 hours from Ottawa in a snowstorm because my mother called and said the family needed to be together for the reading of the will. Let me back up. My grandmother, Irene Bouchard-Lessard, was 81 when she died in October. She was a woman who kept her bank statements in a green accordion folder, who paid her property taxes in person every year at the municipal office in Hawkesbury, who once drove to my apartment with a casserole because I mentioned on the phone that I'd been working late. She was the most organized person I had ever known. Every document she owned was dated, initialed, and filed in alphabetical order. She was also, quietly, quite wealthy. Not in the showy way, in the way of someone who had worked for 40 years, never once upgraded a car that still ran, and let compound interest do what compound interest does. The house alone, a Victorian on the main street of Hawkesbury that she'd owned since 1979, had been appraised at just over $600,000 the year before she passed. There was also the investment account my grandfather had started in the 1980s, and which she continued adding to for 30 years after he died. My mother was her only daughter. My uncle Remy was her only son. I am my mother's only child. I want to be fair here. I want to tell this the way it actually happened, not the way it felt. Because the way it felt, for about 6 months, was like the floor had been taken out from under my whole life. And that kind of feeling makes you want to tell a story that's cleaner than the truth. So here is the truth. My uncle Remy has 2 sons, Theodore, who everyone calls Theo, and the younger one, Bastien. Theo is 32 and has spent the last 7 years working for Remy's property management company in Cornwall. Bastien is 25 and has spent the last 3 years developing a concept for an app that does something involving cryptocurrency and real estate. I've had it explained to me 4 times, and I genuinely cannot tell you what it is. What I can tell you is that it has never launched, never generated revenue, and that my uncle nonetheless bought Bastien a used Audi Q7, approximately $55,000, to project the right image to investors. I know this because my grandmother told me. She told me with a specific look on her face. The look she got when she thought something was wasteful, which was a kind of pressing together of the lips like she was trying not to say something she would regret. We were sitting at her kitchen table in Hawkesbury, the August before she died. I had driven up for the weekend because she hadn't been feeling well and my mother was in Florida visiting a friend. We ate Tourousière from the freezer because neither of us wanted to cook. And she poured us each a small glass of something and she said, I worry about what happens after I'm gone. I told her not to think like that. She gave me that look again. She said, I made a new will in the spring, Lucie. I want you to know that. I made changes. I didn't press her. It felt morbid to press her. I wished, afterward, that I had asked more. She died in her sleep on October 14th. My mother found her in the morning. The following 6 weeks were a blur in the way that grief does. Not dramatic, just relentless. The service, the reception, the casserole brigade, the forms. My mother held herself together the way she always does, with tea and to-do lists, and I drove up every weekend to help her sort through things. My uncle Remy was helpful in the way that people who want something are helpful. He was there every weekend too. He organized the reception. He contacted the funeral home. He found a notary in Cornwall to handle the estate. When my mother thanked him for taking charge, he said, that's what family is for, and smiled, and I noticed, because I am a person who notices things, that he chose the notary himself without consulting her. I mentioned this to my mother. She told me I was being uncharitable. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Friday evening in December, which I thought was strange. Most estate matters I'd heard of happened during business hours, with the notary present. But Remy had apparently arranged for the notary to send a summary document, and he said he'd read it to us himself, to keep things simple. Because the estate was straightforward. I drove up in a snowstorm. The 417 was bad past Castleman, and I sat behind a snowplow for 40 minutes. By the time I got to Hawkesbury, it was nearly 8 o'clock, and my mother and uncle were already at the kitchen table with coffee. Remy had a folder in front of him, I sat down and took off my coat, and my mother poured me coffee without asking, and I thought, this is fine. This is just paperwork. We get through this, and then we grieve properly. My uncle opened the folder. He read the first few pages, the house, which would be listed, and the proceeds split evenly between him and my mother. The RRSP accounts, which had named beneficiaries already. The contents of the house, to be divided by mutual agreement. Then he got to the investment account. He said, the balance of the registered and non-registered investment accounts, valued at approximately $340,000, is to be divided equally among my grandchildren, Theodore, Bastien, and... He stopped. He looked at the paper. He said, My mother said, what? He said there seemed to be a formatting issue with the document. He'd get clarification from the notary. He closed the folder. I said, can I see it? He said there was no need. It was just a summary, and it wasn't perfectly clear. He'd sort it out. I said, I'd like to see it. My mother looked between us. She had the expression she gets when she wants everyone to be calm, which is its own kind of pressure. My uncle slid the folder across the table. I opened it. The third page outlined the investment accounts. It named 3 grandchildren, Theodore, Bastien, and a name I didn't recognize, Chloe Anne Marchand Remy, with a note that she was to receive her portion held in trust until age 30. I read it twice. I said, who is Chloe Anne? Silence. My uncle said that Chloe Anne was Bastien's daughter, his granddaughter, that she was 2 years old and lived in Cornwall. I said, Grandma Irene had a great-grandchild she never mentioned to me. My mother said very quietly, Remy. He said it had been a complicated situation. Bastien and the mother worked together. It hadn't come up, I said, and she left her great-grandchild a share of $340,000, but nothing to me? He said he was sure that wasn't the intent, that there must be a codicil, that the notary would clarify. He said my grandmother loved me, obviously, and this was just a paperwork issue. He was very calm when he said it. That was the thing that struck me later. When I was driving home at midnight in the snow, too wired to stop, he was not surprised. He was not confused. He was managing. I want to tell you that I had a revelation on that drive. I didn't. I had a headache and I cried for about 20 minutes, somewhere near Orleans, and then I turned on the radio and drove the rest of the way home on autopilot. The revelation came later. It came because of my grandmother's green accordion folder. I had taken it home 2 weeks earlier at my mother's request because it contained the utility accounts and insurance policies, and my mother didn't want to deal with it yet. It sat on my kitchen table for 2 weeks while I told myself I'd go through it on the weekend. The weekend after the will reading, I finally opened it. The folder was organized the way my grandmother organized everything. Tabs labeled in her handwriting, CRA, insurance, property tax, investments, legal. Behind the legal tab, there were several documents. The title transfer from 1979, her marriage certificate, my grandfather's death certificate, and behind those, folded in thirds, a document on notarial paper with a date stamp from the previous April. A will. I sat down. I read it twice. Then I read it third time. It named me. Lucie Beaumont Tremblay. It named me for a 1/3 share of the investment accounts alongside Theodore and Bastien, and a specific bequest of $25,000 to support her professional development. It described in plain language exactly what my grandmother had told me at her kitchen table in August, that she had made changes in the spring because she wanted to be fair, and she knew that fair was not the same as equal. The will in Remy's folder was dated July. The one in the green accordion folder was dated April. I am not a lawyer. I'm a project coordinator for a mid-sized engineering firm in Ottawa, and I know a lot about procurement timelines and almost nothing about estate law. But I know what I know, which is that my grandmother organized her documents in chronological order. The April will was at the back. The documents at the front of the legal tab were the most recent. I also know, because I once had to verify contractor documents for work, that PDFs have properties. Author, creation date, modification date. If you know where to look, those properties tell you when a document was actually created, regardless of what date is printed on it. I took a photograph of the will from the folder. I emailed it to myself. Then I called a friend from university, Privacy, who articled at an estates firm in Toronto before moving to Ottawa. I asked her if she could recommend someone. She said, Lucie, just tell me what's happening. So I told her. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay, don't say anything to your uncle yet. Don't say anything to anyone. Can you bring me the document?" I drove to her apartment with the folder. She looked at the April will for a long time. She looked at the summary document Ramy had read from. She asked me several questions I didn't know the answers to. Who had chosen the notary in Cornwall? Whether my grandmother had ever mentioned that notary by name? Whether there were other documents in the folder from that notary? There were not. The April will was from a different notary entirely, a woman in Hawkesbury whose name I recognized because her office was on the same block as the pharmacy where my grandmother filled her prescriptions. Pretty said, "I think you should call this notary on Monday." I did. Her name was Maitre Deschênes. She remembered my grandmother immediately. She said, "Oui, Madame Irene, of course." She was very clear about what she wanted. She said she had prepared a will in April and a codicil in September, after my grandmother had been diagnosed. She said she had expected to be contacted by the estate. She had not been contacted. I asked her if she could send me a copy of the will and the codicil. She said she would need to verify my status, but yes, as a named beneficiary, I was entitled to a copy. The codicil, which I received 3 days later, was 8 paragraphs long. The last paragraph contained a sentence I have read so many times since then that I could say it in my sleep. I have intentionally made no provision in this will for any professional I have not personally retained, as I have found certain recent consultations to be conducted without my full knowledge or consent. My grandmother, 81 years old, 3 weeks before she died, still filing things in alphabetical order. I took everything to a lawyer, a proper estates lawyer, not Pretty's firm because she didn't practice in that area, but someone she trusted. He reviewed both wills, the codicil and the summary document Ramy had read at the kitchen table. He said the summary document contained several material inaccuracies. He said the will Ramy had used, the July document, appeared to have been prepared by the notary Ramy had chosen. He said it was possible my grandmother had retained 2 different notaries, but it was unusual. He said the codicil language was notable. Then he sent a letter. I was not present when my uncle received the letter. I was in Ottawa at my desk eating a sandwich when my phone rang. My mother. She said, "Lucie, what did you do?" I said, "I found Grandma's will." She said, "Ramy says you hired a lawyer to go after the estate." I said, "I found Grandma's will, the one she made herself with a notary she chose herself in April, and a codicil from September." Silence on the line. Then my mother said, "He said there was only one will." I said, "I know what he said." She came to Ottawa the following weekend. I made tea and spread everything on my kitchen table. The April will, the codicil, the letter from Maitre Deschênes, the summary document, printed copies of the PDF metadata showing creation dates that did not match the dates printed on the document Remy had read from. My mother sat at my table and read for a long time. She is not a dramatic person. She didn't cry. She just read, very carefully, the way she reads anything important: utility bills, lease agreements, the ingredients list on something she's suspicious of. When she finished, she said, "He made changes to the document." I said, "That's what the metadata suggests." She said, "He changed Mother's will." I said, "That's what the evidence suggests." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She called me in September. She said she'd been thinking about fairness. I thought she was just being, you know how she was. I didn't know she'd made changes." We sat in my kitchen for a long time after that without talking much. I made more tea. At some point, she started crying, quietly, and I put my hand over hers and we stayed like that until it stopped. The legal process took 8 months. I won't make it sound cleaner than it was. It was expensive and exhausting, and there were stretches where I genuinely didn't know if it was worth it. My uncle retained his own lawyer. There were letters and counter letters. There was a mediation session in May that ended with my uncle's lawyer asking for an adjournment because his client needed time to gather documentation. He did not gather documentation that helped him. The Cornwall notary, the one Ramy had chosen, was interviewed. He said he had prepared the will in July at the request of the estate trustee, who had represented to him that it was a revision reflecting Madame Irene's updated wishes. He said Madame Irene had not been present at the drafting. He said he had not spoken to her directly. That was the piece. My grandmother had not been present when the July will was created. The estate was ultimately probated under the April will and the September codicil. My share of the investment accounts was approximately $113,000. The $25,000 professional bequest was included. The legal costs came off the top of the estate, which I was told was standard but which still stung, because it was her money, and she'd worked for every dollar of it. My uncle was not charged criminally. The investigation was referred to the Law Society, and I was told it was ongoing. But I have learned not to hold my breath about timelines. He has not spoken to me since the mediation. He and my mother speak occasionally, briefly, in a way that sounds like two people being careful. I still have the green accordion folder. It's in my closet in Ottawa. I can't bring myself to throw it out, and I'm not sure I want to. There's a restaurant in Hawkesbury that my grandmother used to take me to every birthday, a small Italian place on the main street, cash only, run by the same family since before I was born. The last time I went, maybe a year after everything was settled, I ordered the same thing she always ordered, and I sat in the booth by the window, and I thought about her sitting at her kitchen table in August, folding her hands, telling me she'd made changes. She knew. That's what I keep coming back to. She'd seen something or felt something, and she'd done what she could with the time and the clarity she had left. She made a second appointment with a notary she'd chosen herself, and she told that notary exactly what she wanted. And then she went home and put it in the green folder behind the legal tab, where she put everything that mattered. She didn't tell me what to look for. She just trusted me to look. My mother asked me once, during the worst of it, whether I thought Grandma Irene had meant for this to happen. The conflict, the legal process, the fracture in the family, whether she'd seen it coming. I said, I didn't know. But I think she did what she could, with what she had. I think she sat at a desk in a notary's office in Hawkesbury, and she said what she meant as clearly as she could. And she trusted that clarity to survive her, and it did. That's the thing about paper, about a properly witnessed, properly filed, properly dated document sitting in a green accordion folder in alphabetical order behind a tab that says legal. It's quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain itself. It just waits. I wasn't the only one who knew the truth. My grandmother knew it. She just needed someone to stay calm long enough to find it. I was her only grandchild who didn't throw the envelope in the fire. I've thought a lot about what my grandmother actually gave me. Not the $113,000, though I won't pretend that didn't matter. It paid off a significant chunk of debt and let me breathe in a way I hadn't in years. But that's not what I mean. What she gave me was the example of someone who, facing the end of her life, still chose to be precise, still chose to be fair. She didn't leave a note. She didn't call me and explain. She sat down with a notary she trusted, in a town she'd lived in for 50 years, and she said exactly what she meant. And then she went home and filed it where she filed everything that mattered. I think about Raimi sometimes, and I try not to make him into a monster, because I don't think the truth is that clean. I think he told himself a story where he was protecting the family's assets, where he knew better than an old woman what should happen to her money, where the adjustments he made were just practical. People rarely do the thing they do while believing it's wrong. They build a version of events where they're the reasonable one, and they live inside that version until something external, a letter from a lawyer, a document with a creation date that doesn't match, forces the version to collapse. That's not a defense of what he did. It's just what I've come to understand about how people justify things to themselves. The self-deception comes first. The harm comes second. What I know is this. My grandmother made a choice. She retained her own notary without telling anyone because she had seen something that made her want a record she controlled. That takes a kind of quiet intelligence that I find, honestly, more impressive than anything dramatic. She didn't confront anyone. She didn't threaten. She just acted, carefully, with the time she had left. I think about that when things at work feel complicated, when I'm in a meeting and I can feel the room tilting in a direction that isn't quite honest. I think about what it looks like to just do the right thing without announcing it, to document, to be precise, to trust that clarity, if you create it carefully enough, can survive you. The 8 months of legal process were genuinely hard. There were weeks where I second-guessed everything. Whether I was being vindictive, whether I was blowing up the family over money, whether my grandmother would have wanted this. I kept coming back to the codicil, that last paragraph, about not providing for professionals she hadn't personally retained. She wrote that 3 weeks before she died. She was not confused. She was not being managed. She was being exactly as clear as she had always been, and she was leaving a record of it. The grief and the legal fight got tangled together in a way that was hard to separate. I was mourning her while simultaneously fighting over her estate, and the two things made each other worse. What helped, eventually, was remembering that the fight wasn't mine. It was hers, and she'd already done most of the work. I just had to be patient enough to find it. I still have the green accordion folder. I'm not sure I'll ever throw it out. Patience isn't passive. That's the thing I keep wanting to say when I tell the story. Staying calm in that kitchen while my uncle closed the folder, driving home at midnight without calling anyone, opening the folder 2 weeks later instead of leaving it for another month. None of that was easy. It required something. It required the belief that if you look carefully enough and you keep your head, the truth has a way of being findable. My grandmother knew that. She'd known it her whole life. She just trusted me to know it too.